The night HOA Karen screamed at me beneath the crooked oaks, I knew the story wouldn't end with an apology, it would end with ownership. Her voice sliced through the dark like a siren, accusing me of trespass, arrogance, and, apparently, the downfall of the entire neighborhood. I was camping on a forgotten stretch of scrubland behind her fence, a place the maps barely bothered to mark, yet she treated it like the crown jewels of the subdivision. My lantern flickered, the wind hissed through the grass, and I felt every eye of the cul-de-sac watching, phones raised, whispering that I didn't belong. What they didn't know was that I had come here to breathe. After the storm, after the layoffs, after my old life collapsed like rotten timber, this little patch of earth felt like a promise. Karen didn't see that. She saw a threat to her rules, her order, her carefully manicured silence. She marched toward me with a clipboard and fury, shouting codes, fines, and threats about the board. Each word echoed off the fences, and instead of shrinking, a strange calm washed over me. I realized something powerful in that moment: land only controls you when someone else owns it. The creek shimmered in the moonlight, the ground pulsed with quiet strength, and I thought, if this place means so much to her, then it's worth far more to me. I packed my tent slowly, not because I was scared, but because a plan was forming, a plan bigger than her clipboard, bigger than every letter she would ever tape to my door. By the time I walked away, I wasn't defeated. I was determined. Tomorrow I would find out who held the deed to this forgotten strip of wild, and I would make the boldest purchase of my life. Not out of revenge, though Karen would feel it, but because this land had just chosen its owner. As I drove home, the engine rattled like a stubborn heartbeat, yet every mile felt lighter. The town lights faded behind me, and the horizon stretched wide, whispering that tomorrow wouldn't simply be another day, it would be the first step toward a future I would build with my own hands. I didn't know how much the land cost, or how many barriers the board would throw in my path, but I knew this: I was done asking permission to exist. Karen's scream had sparked something unstoppable, and by sunrise, the papers, the calls, and the fight would all begin with one unwavering promise: this time, I would own the ground beneath my dreams. And that single decision would change her world, my world, and everything between us forever after. At sunrise I sat in the county records office, the fluorescent lights buzzing like restless insects above my head, and the clerk eyed me with the tired curiosity reserved for dreamers and troublemakers. The parcel number looked forgotten, a relic tucked between subdivisions, and when she slid the folder across the counter, dust rose like a blessing. The owner had passed away years ago, leaving the land tangled in paperwork and unpaid taxes, and every note in the margins whispered neglect. To most people it was useless scrub. To me, it was a door. I made the offer that morning, my hands shaking as I signed forms thicker than a novel, each page a promise that I would not turn back. Karen might have believed her rules were iron, but the law loved ink, and my signature flowed like a river claiming its valley. While the clerk processed the deed, I stepped outside and felt the wind tear across the parking lot, carrying the faint smell of cedar from the hills beyond. I drove straight to the property, the tires crunching over gravel like quiet thunder, and when I reached the weathered fence, Karen was already there, her arms crossed, eyes sharp as glass. She demanded to know why I had returned, certain the board had frightened me away. I smiled, unfolded the paper, and let the gold seal catch the sun. The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. I didn't come back to camp, I said. I came home. Her voice wavered, then hardened, warning me that ownership didn't excuse defiance, that the HOA would bury my dreams in meetings and fines. But the land behind us hummed with possibility, and I could almost see the ranch rising from the soil: corrals, warm lights, open gates, a place built from sweat instead of fear. I thanked her for the motivation, because without that midnight confrontation I might never have discovered what courage sounded like when spoken aloud. As she stormed away, the air felt cleaner, and I walked the boundary line, counting steps, mapping dreams, promising the land that I would restore every inch. Vines curled around broken posts, birds leapt from the brush, and the creek murmured like a hidden engine. This wasn't revenge, it was rebirth, and the first nail, the first beam, the first long day of labor waited just ahead. I whispered to myself that I would build something rooted deeper than rules, something strong enough to outlast anger, and when the dust finally settled, the world would see not a trespasser, but a founder. By dusk the papers were recorded, and the land was mine at last, and I vowed that tomorrow the building would finally begin beneath the widening sky tonight. Work began the next morning, when the first truck rattled onto the property and the smell of fresh lumber rolled through the cool air like courage made real. I had no crew, only a notebook of sketches, a rented post driver, and a promise to the land that every strike would honor its quiet history. The sun climbed slow and steady while dust rose around my boots, and the rhythm of steel on earth became a heartbeat that refused to quit. Neighbors gathered along the fence, whispering like spectators at a legend being written, and though some shook their heads, others smiled with cautious hope. I welcomed them, offered water, and explained that this ranch would not close people out, it would invite them in, a place for work, animals, and breathing room. Word traveled faster than nails, and by noon 2 old farmers arrived with stories, tools, and laughter strong enough to lift beams. We marked corridors for the stables, traced lines for corrals, and cleared thorny brush that had hidden the creek from sight for years. Every branch we carried away revealed another glimmer of water, and the sound of it braiding through stone felt like the land finally speaking back. Karen watched from her patio, arms folded, lips tight, yet even her glare trembled when the first gate rose and swung open with a proud creak. She called the board that evening, promising complaints and hearings, but I answered with receipts, permits, and patience, knowing the strongest walls are built long before opposition arrives. Night fell golden over the half-raised fence, and we shared bread by lantern light while coyotes sang beyond the ridge. I realized the ranch was already alive, not in wood or metal, but in the people who believed in it. Tomorrow would bring heavier beams and louder arguments, yet my resolve burned brighter than the lanterns, because this dream no longer belonged to one stubborn camper, it belonged to a growing community. And as the wind slipped across the clearing, it carried a promise that every challenge ahead would carve us stronger, the way rivers carve valleys into maps no ordnance can erase. I closed my eyes and pictured cattle grazing where weeds once ruled, children learning the patience of caring for colts, and travelers finding rest beside the restored creek. The stars rose like silent witnesses, and I whispered thanks to the land for trusting me with its wild heart, vowing that I would keep building until dawn crowned every post with light. Whatever battles waited, I would meet them with steady hands, because this place was no longer a boundary between neighbors, it was the beginning of a life rewritten from the soil up for everyone who believed together. The hearings arrived like storm clouds, heavy with murmurs and folded papers, and the community hall smelled of coffee, dust, and quiet doubt as I took my seat before the HOA board. Karen sat rigid at the front, her binder stacked high with photos of posts, trucks, and footprints in the sand, every page meant to freeze progress in place. The chairwoman asked me to speak, and I told the story of the land, of the neglected creek we had uncovered, of the neighbors who found purpose in rebuilding something they could touch. I spoke calmly, not to win a fight, but to show that a ranch can grow alongside a neighborhood without swallowing it. Some members frowned, expecting defiance. Instead they heard intention, maintenance plans, and proof that every permit was earned through patience, sweat, and lawful ink. When Karen rose, her voice cracked with anger and fear, warning that my ranch would invite noise, strangers, and change that could not be controlled. Yet as she listed grievances, people from the back stood and shared how the open gates had helped them breathe easier, how the trails we cleared gave their children safe paths to wander. The room shifted like a tide. The board paused, reviewed receipts, maps, and letters, and finally declared the project compliant, provided we continued caring for the creek, the fencing, and the peace of the surrounding homes. Applause rustled across the hall, soft but unstoppable, and Karen's binder sagged as though its weight had finally found the floor. That night I returned to the land beneath a violet dusk, and the wind carried the faint echo of clapping leaves across the pasture. We lit lanterns along the new corral and drove the final nails into the long western fence, each strike ringing like a bell of promise. The creek shimmered under the moon, reflecting the sky in broken silver, and I realized the ranch was no longer a dream defended, it was a future accepted. Karen watched from her porch, and for a breath I saw something gentler in her eyes, not surrender, but understanding that this place was built with respect, not defiance. I nodded to her across the fence, a quiet truce stitched into the night air, and turned back to the work ahead. Tomorrow would bring animals, routines, and early mornings, and the ranch would need every ounce of heart we could give it. But as the lanterns dimmed, I knew one truth was already stronger than any rulebook: the land and its people were finally growing together. And with every breath the horizon widened, promising that our greatest work, our greatest courage, was still ahead, waiting at dawn beyond the whispering gates for all who chose to build. Dawn broke with the sound of hooves in my imagination long before any animals arrived, and the air over the pasture tasted like cold metal and pine as we prepared the ranch for its first living residents. The barns stood tall now, their beams sealed and sanded, smelling of cedar and sweat, and the wide gates opened toward a horizon that no longer felt uncertain. A local rescue group had called after hearing about our project, asking whether abandoned horses and weary cattle might find a second life here, and I said yes before hesitation could speak. By mid-morning the trailers rolled in, engines rumbling like distant thunder across the valley, and neighbors gathered quietly along the fence, their faces bright with cautious wonder. The first mare stepped onto the soil with a trembling breath, ribs sharp beneath a fading coat, but when the sunlight washed across her back, she lifted her head as if remembering the shape of freedom. We moved slowly, guiding her toward the soft corral, and the earth settled beneath her hooves like it had been waiting. One by one the animals followed a stubborn gelding with patient eyes, two calves who stuck close together, a weathered steer who paused to drink from the restored creek. The land accepted them without ceremony, and the silence filling the pasture felt like gratitude. All afternoon we worked in quiet rhythm, spreading hay, checking latches, learning each animal's habits the way you learn the breathing of a house at night. Karen watched again from her porch, but this time she stepped closer, curiosity tugging at the corners of her expression. She asked whether the rescue would bring more animals, whether the children from the neighborhood might help brush the horses on weekends, whether the trails would remain open. I answered honestly yes, with care, yes, with supervision, yes, because a ranch loses nothing by sharing hope. For a moment we stood together at the fence, listening to the creek whisper along the stones, and she admitted that fear had made her loud, that change had sounded like loss until she saw what grew in its place. I thanked her for speaking her truth, and the truce between us rooted deeper than any post I had driven. As evening folded over the hills, the animals settled into their stalls, lanterns glowed like low stars, and I realized the ranch had claimed its soul not through conflict, but through compassion that turned wilderness into refuge and neighbors into guardians. Tomorrow would test that promise with new challenges from weather, finances, and the board's lingering doubts, yet my resolve felt broader than the valley, ready to carry every burden the ranch placed upon my willing shoulders through every season. The first real test arrived with the storm that rolled over the hills like a steel tide, and by noon the sky bruised purple while the wind tore at every hinge and rope across the ranch. We had been warned about winter squalls, yet nothing prepared us for the sharp howl that rattled the barns and sent the cattle pressing close together for safety. I moved from stall to stall with soaked gloves, tightening lines, calming the horses, and feeling the ground shudder beneath each gust. Karen appeared at the gate with a raincoat and a determination I had never seen in her eyes before, carrying spare tarps and a thermos of scalding coffee that steamed like courage in the cold air. We worked side by side without hesitation, her voice steady as she counted posts while I braced the western fence, and neighbors poured in behind her with flashlights, blankets, and grit that burned brighter than fear. The creek rose fast, frothing against its stones, and for a breath I worried it would swallow the lower pasture, undoing months of restoration, but the channels we had cleared held strong, guiding the surge along its path like a river remembering its own bones. When the worst gust struck, one great beam cracked near the corral and the mare reared in panic, hooves sparking against the wood. Karen stepped forward first, whispering to the trembling animal, and I slid the support beneath the splintered rail while the neighbors formed a human brace against the rain. Together we held the line until the wind loosened its grip and the clouds finally broke apart into shreds of silver twilight. Afterward, silence settled over the ranch with the fragile sweetness of survival. The animals breathed slow again, the fence stood firm, and every face around me glowed with exhaustion and relief. Karen met my eyes and laughed softly, admitting that no meeting could ever bind people the way shared danger does. I thanked everyone, promising hot soup and rest, yet inside I felt something deeper, the realization that the ranch belonged to all of us now, not by deed or boundary, but by the work we carried through the storm together. That night I walked the perimeter beneath a washed clean sky, counting the repaired posts and the blessings stitched into every joint, and I knew the coming chapters would bring harder choices: money, expansion, trust. Still, the storm had proven our strength, and the horizon felt brighter than ever, waiting for tomorrow. I promised myself that every lesson from this trial would shape the ranch with patience, courage, and gratitude, and that when the next challenge rose, we would face it united, stronger than before under the wide and faithful western sky forever. Spring returned with quiet brightness, and the ranch breathed like a patient giant waking after the storm. The fields shimmered with new grass, the creek whispered against its stones, and every animal moved with a calmer rhythm, as if they too understood we had survived something defining. Yet as I walked the pasture at dawn, clipboard in hand, reality pressed gently at my shoulders: repairs, feed costs, medical care, and the endless math that decides whether a dream keeps growing or quietly fades. Hope alone could not balance ledgers, and I knew we needed a way to strengthen the ranch without selling its soul. So the idea rose from the land itself, to open our gates not as spectacle, but as a school of compassion and work. We organized volunteer days, small tours, and hands-on workshops about rescue care, fencing, stewardship, and the patient art of restoring damaged ground. Families arrived with cautious steps and open hearts, listening to the stories of the mare who had learned to trust again, the calves who refused to be separated, the stubborn gelding whose silence carried a history no words could touch. Laughter echoed across the paddocks, and donations flowed not from pity, but from connection. Karen stood beside me during the first open day, guiding guests along the trail she once fought to erase. She spoke honestly about fear, about change, about the way control can disguise itself as protection, and people listened because her transformation felt as real as the wind in the grass. Together we built benches near the creek, planted native shrubs to hold the banks, and painted signs that asked visitors to move slowly, to notice, to care. The ranch was no longer a boundary between lives, it was a bridge. But with growth came attention, and attention drew opportunity wrapped in risk. A developer approached the board with promises of paved trails, gift shops, and a rebranded heritage attraction that would swallow our fields beneath polished stone. The offer dazzled some neighbors, threatened others, and rekindled every doubt I thought we had buried. Papers rustled like wings of a gathering storm as meetings filled again, and I felt the future tilt between two paths, one paved with profit, the other with purpose. That night I walked the ridge alone, listening to the horses breathe and the creek murmur through the dark, and I knew the next decision would define everything we had built, whether this place remained a refuge shaped by hands and heart, or became another monument polished smooth by money and distance. The meeting that decided our future filled the hall with murmurs, maps, and the polished confidence of the developer's team. They spoke of revenue, tourism, signage, and carefully curated trails, promising safety and prestige while reducing the ranch to a feature on a brochure. I listened as neighbors weighed convenience against memory, and Karen leaned toward me, whispering that progress without soul was only displacement. When my turn came, I described Don Shores, the way the rescued mare trusted the smallest child, the creek's patient recovery, and the storm that bound us together. I said we could open our gates wider without selling the heartbeat that made the place matter. Silence gathered like rain. Then people rose one by one, recalling laughter, effort, and the courage they discovered in the fields. The developer frowned, sensing the current tilting away. The board finally voted to reject the proposal and recognize the ranch as a community stewardship project, independent and living. Relief washed through the room like sunlight through storm clouds. Outside, the wind carried the scent of grass, and Karen placed her hand on the fence, promising she would stand beside us when the next challenge arrived. That evening we gathered near the creek, hanging lanterns from branches like new constellations. Volunteers shared plans for gardens, trail markers, and a small classroom where children could learn the stories of the land. I felt the weight of every decision lift from my shoulders, replaced by a steadier responsibility, to guide, not own. The animals grazed quietly, and the water shimmered with the promise of seasons still to come. I understood that victory was not triumph over opposition but commitment to care even when no one was watching. Under the deepening sky I vowed to honor every voice that helped us endure, knowing the true story of the ranch had only begun to unfold in the hands of those who chose community over convenience. Tomorrow we would plant roots deeper than any survey line, trusting the land to answer our faith with quiet strength and endless possibility. By lantern light we signed a charter promising transparency, patience, and shared stewardship, and the ink gleamed like water on stone. The circle around the fire widened as new volunteers stepped forward, offering time, craft, and open hands. Karen smiled through quiet tears, saying that courage sometimes sounds like listening. I watched the flames bend in the breeze and felt the ranch settle into a peace earned through struggle and grace. Tomorrow would bring labor, but tonight we rested, knowing the future belonged not to fear or argument but to the steady work of neighbors standing together beneath the patient stars that watched our promise take root in the waiting earth forever and always ahead together. The years that followed did not glide forward like a simple victory, they unfolded as seasons of effort, patience, and renewal. Every spring the pasture answered our work with bright grass, and every winter tested our resolve, yet the ranch endured because it belonged to many hearts instead of one. Children who once visited nervously returned as confident helpers, guiding newcomers along the creek where willows rooted deeper each year. Karen became our fiercest advocate, reminding the board that stewardship thrives when people feel responsible rather than restrained. I watched her laugh beside the mare she once feared, brushing its coat with a tenderness that surprised us both. On the anniversary of the night she screamed across the fence, we gathered under lanterns and told the story again, not as a tale of conflict but as the beginning of courage. I spoke about the first deed, the storm, the vote, and the moment I realized ownership means nothing without service. The crowd listened quietly, and in their faces I saw the living proof that land can heal people who choose to heal it back. As the evening deepened, the creek murmured like a familiar song, and the horses breathed a steady chorus of contentment. I walked the boundary one last time, tracing every post I had driven on that first uncertain day, and I understood how far we had traveled. What began as defiance had become devotion, what began as camping had become community. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, because the ranch spoke for itself through every hoofprint, every seedling, every shared sunrise. I thanked the land aloud, promising to keep learning from its patience and strength, and I knew that whatever paths awaited beyond the hills, this place would remain a testament to what happens when neighbors choose courage over control. Tomorrow would bring work as always, but tonight the stars crowned the ranch with quiet grace, and I felt gratitude settle deeper than any root, knowing the story we built here would echo far beyond fences, guiding every wanderer who seeks a place to stand and begin again with hope and steady hands forever and always in light and shadow together as one enduring home beneath the open sky at last. The future remains unwritten, yet I welcome its questions, because every challenge will remind us who we became here. When visitors ask how it started, I smile and tell them the truth. A woman shouted, a camper listened, and the land answered. From that moment forward we chose to build, not burn, and the ranch continues to breathe with every heart that finds belonging in its fields. I leave this chapter open, trusting the next voices will write their own lines, carrying promise.